Okay, it's 4 o'clock, so I'm going to get started with our third panel. So just a little reminder that we are videoing this session, so if anyone does have a problem with this, just to let us know. But it will only be shared to participants of the workshop. And also just a quick reminder, if you can all just make sure you are on mute, just so we don't have any distractions during our presentations, that would be gratefully appreciated. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce to you our third panel, entitled The Acts of Remembrance, Sources of Performance, Art and Education. And we are going to get started with our first panellist, Alexandra Birch, who will be starting shortly at UC Santa Barbara, and her paper is entitled Interpretive Memory, Music and Memory of the Holocaust. So if Alexandra, if you'd like to get started.
Hi there. Okay, there we go. So thank you all for having us. First of all, I'm so glad to see a panel on culture and commemoration and culture and sources of memory for us. I'm going to share screen really quickly and show this slide, which I think will be useful. There we go. So I want to briefly discuss the use of non-text music in commemoration and memory of the Holocaust. I'm a violinist, and I did my doctoral in violin performance, and I'm now working on musicology. So in looking at non-text music, I want to pay attention to the ways, first of all, that it serves as a mode of personal testament. So often these pieces, particularly when discussing Soviet works, were something that was a personal commemoration that was then consigned to a drawer for many years. I also want to look at how they serve as preservation of creative peoples more broadly. So when we're talking about particularly like the Holocaust in Ukraine or in Belarus, where the survival rate was extraordinarily low, and often where entire families were murdered, looking at creative peoples, especially like, for example, performers who were not able to, they didn't leave written works as composers or say poets did. Something like these commemorative works can be preservation of these type of creative people. Kind of fourthly, I'm looking at nonverbal representation as being indicative of a collective trauma. So how because we're not explicitly using text, particularly once again dealing with like post-war Soviet censorship and things like that, this non-verbal representation allowed for more expressive use of things like Jewish idioms in music, or even Roma idioms in music. And then this can be, because it's so suppressed, and because often these musical works are preserving specific things like religious themes or specific cantorial themes from an area, as I'm going to discuss in my talk about the Émile Levand piece that you see projected. These nonverbal representations can be more representative of an entire ethnic group or of a trauma from a particular region. Finally, I want to draw attention to the fact that this can be a truly international means of communication. So in incorporating these pieces into everything from concert series to museums to conferences like this, it allows for a non-text, very evocative inclusion into programs where you don't necessarily need to speak English or Russian or French or any of the host of languages that we do research on the Holocaust to be utilized, We can work with Ukrainian composers, we can work with Hungarian composers and not need to necessarily work with those languages. A small anecdotal aside about this is I was performing like a piece at Yad Vashem, and many of the people in attendance were Rwandan genocide survivors.
Alexandra, I think there is an acoustic feedback in the audio. You need to lower down the volume of your speakers because there's acoustic feedback coming in.
There we go. Is that better? There we go. Okay. So it was, it's a really fantastic thing to be able to communicate internationally that way with music. So the first piece that I want to discuss is actually a piece by Victor Ullmann. Victor Ullmann was a composer heavily associated with the Holocaust because he was interred first in Theresienstadt and associated with many of the works that were composed there, including Der Kaiser von Atlantis, which was a satirical work about Hitler, and also associated with the opera Brumdibar, which was the children's opera in Theresienstadt. Victor Ullmann was unfortunately deported to Auschwitz in 1944, where he died in the camp. There are, about his violin sonata, there are several apocryphal tales that his violin sonata was composed in Auschwitz. This is impossible, he was there less than one day. And the real violin sonata has been now found in an archive in Switzerland and dates from 1939. However, the sonata is written for violin and piano, and only the violin part has survived. So one of the things that we look at when we're looking at commemorative works is this piece was not specifically meant to be a commemorative piece, but rather it's something where it's being used commemoratively because of the composer's victimhood. And so in doing so, and particularly in using a pre-war work, the decision to not reconstruct the piano part and rather only perform this as a sonata for solo violin is in and of itself a commemorative practice. So if I play a little bit of the opening of the sonata for you, you'll be able to hear that there are silences in it that would be filled by the piano. And artistically, this allows for kind of the sense of things that are lost remain lost, or you're still performing the composer's work, but maybe the whole thing can't be reclaimed. So I'm going to play this and play a little bit of the opening for you and see how, if you see what you think. So there are some silences in the violin part, and of course as we continue on for the full movement. The only part of this that I've recorded or worked with is the adagio movement, this slow movement that I just played for you. The reason being it serves as kind of a nice elegy, and the violin part is pretty continuous even without the piano. And so this is an interesting way to use a non-commemorative work commemoratively, and also to use a really extraordinary piece of Ullmann's writing pre-war and not focus exclusively on the pieces that were composed in the camps, and therefore more indicative of his victimhood. Secondly, and very briefly, I'll discuss a piece of music that's used also very evocatively in the Sinti and Roma Memorial in Berlin. It is a piece composed by a Sinti composer, Romeo Franz, who actually now serves in the German government. And this piece is also for solo violin. It's used extremely evocatively, and I think that it's interesting that after discussions with these communities, because the composer is ultimately a politician, the decision was made to include this piece in the memorial specifically because one of the things that the Sinti and Roma communities in Germany and also in Austria wanted commemorated was their musical experience and their musical experience with the war. So this piece ends up being a really beautiful, like kind of solo violin thing across also physical memorial. It's played through speakers. And one of the things that I would draw attention to is that they've changed the sound levels throughout the memorial so that you have a different experience of the piece no matter where you are in the physical memorial. So that's kind of another way that you could incorporate music into, say, physical memorialization. And finally, I would like to discuss this piece by Emile Levand, which you see up here. Emile Levand is a composer who I discovered in the archive at USHMM. He's basically an unknown composer, but was a fairly prolific violinist within the USSR. He kind of hits on all these different points of victimhood that we're now expanding our understanding of in Holocaust studies, where he served in the Red Army. He unfortunately lost his family in mass shootings in Ukraine. And he also was recalled from the Red Army so that he could raise morale in Moscow. Emile Levand is also an interesting composer because, as I mentioned, he, composing in the USSR, consigned this work, a poem about the Holocaust, to the drawer for many years. And this piece is very, very evocatively Jewish. So it has kind of this cantorial theme that you'll hear throughout. And I'll play that theme for you very quickly. So it has this very underlying theme of kind of like Jewish religious music. I was actually able to trace the theme to a rabbi from near Balta, Ukraine. So it is based on an actual religious text. And then finally, this piece has, when we're discussing aesthetic differences between, for example, pieces between the East and the West, this piece specifically addresses the idea of mass shootings in its musical commemoration. I should note that this piece was given to USHMM in 1993. It had never been performed except for by the composer, and then I re-accessed it in 2015. So this same cantorial theme is presented halfway through the piece, and it this time is presented very quietly, and it's interrupted by a musical representation of these shootings. So in doing that, in presenting, for example, this piece alongside a piece by Shostakovich or a more canonical Soviet work, the audience members may gain a different experience and a different perspective of the Holocaust than perhaps the one that they have been exposed to, or the one even with they're familiar in a museum. So what I ultimately hope is that this research can bridge the gap between a performer and a researcher, and that also this can bring the discussion of memory more broadly to a wider audience and literally through performance. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. That was so interesting. Thank you. So our next presenter is Caroline Slifkin, and she's a Holocaust educator, and she will be speaking on the role Holocaust art can play when teaching about the Holocaust. Just a reminder to everyone as well, as before, if you can continue to pop your questions into the chat box, and then we'll come to them all at the end. So over to you, Caroline.
Oh, thank you. Hello, everybody. Mine's probably going to have the most images with it being about visual art. I'll just say all the images you see at the moment and throughout are student response images by the two artists that obviously I'll tell you who they are as we go through. Okay, so I'm going to have to scroll because I'm on an iPad. Okay, so Holocaust can be seen as a defining event in human history, and the study of it can help students to think critically about the world around them. Teaching the Holocaust in history is essential, but it can be taught with a cross-curricular approach. The study of Holocaust art can highlight how the Nazis used art for propaganda purposes and how victims used artistic expression to document, communicate their protest, despair, and/or hope. Learning about the Holocaust encourages students to confront fundamental questions which can cut across academic disciplines. Art can play an important role in this respect, both as a distinct subject in itself and through its incorporation into other subjects, such as history, religious education, or English, not exclusively those as well. The study of the Holocaust-related art, whether in art or in other subjects, can deepen students' appreciation of the history of the Holocaust. This is partly due to art's ability to engage a variety of learning styles, particularly, of course, for more visual learners. Students are able to explore the diverse experiences of Holocaust victims and survivors, including their lives before the war, as well as during it, and most importantly, afterwards into the present day. In so doing, we begin to rehumanize the individuals, families and communities who suffered during the Holocaust. Art enables students to deepen and broaden their understanding of Jewish resistance to the Holocaust, to examine interpretations of the Holocaust as expressed in contemporary art, art exhibitions and memorials, providing insights into the ever-evolving impact of the Holocaust and its legacy on different societies. Such study potentially has more benefits, personal benefits for students. Through the use of visual images, students are able to develop a visual literacy to add to their skills of critical thinking in order to understand, recognise and evaluate art as a means of expression, and their awareness of the role of art in society. Furthermore, learning about the Holocaust can evoke powerful emotions, and using the arts can help students to express their thoughts, ideas and responses in an appropriate and creative way. Through this questioning, students are able to investigate human behaviour and come to appreciate that silence and indifference to suffering of others, however unintentional, can lead to the events that that legalise discrimination, prejudice, hatred, and ultimately mass murder. The production of works of Jewish culture, a culture which the Nazis were seeking to destroy, was in itself a form of resistance. It could be said that the very act of creation can be seen as resistance, since it represented an assertion of faith in humanistic values in the midst of horror. By exhibiting beauty and bringing pleasure, art could also often attempt to sustain the morale of ghetto and camp inhabitants, which again can be linked to resistance in the face of attempted extermination. Most of the artworks created in ghettos and camps were destroyed during the Holocaust. The fraction that have survived stands as a reminder of the astonishing resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable circumstances. So getting to the crux of about starting to use art with students. So by looking at several artists or just one artist or just one image, depending on your subject, they're already learning from the artist and their story. We call this a rehumanizing layer. And the instance I'm going to look at is one specific session looking at Holocaust art as spiritual resistance. So again, they're already looking at this, the idea of the religious layer. And then you'll see through questioning, higher order thinking, the pedagogical layer. So the rationale of using art in teaching about the Holocaust. Art is recognised as a way of young people or any people expressing and reflecting on trauma they may have already experienced in their own lives, they may have witnessed experience, but also to then understand the trauma experience of other people's, as particularly looking through art. So in my sessions, I create a safe area for a variety of learners, and art allows for differentiation and for expression of a reflective nature. So as I say, I'm going to focus just on one aspect of many that I do, spiritual resistance. I'm going to look at just two of the artists I use. Samuel Bach and Haya Stoicher, coincidentally both born in 1933 when Hitler comes to power, and both express a lot through their art through landscapes. So I'll just scroll through some of his work while I give you a little bit of background. He's born in Vilna, was Poland, now back Lithuania, in August 1933. And at the age of 8, he's sent to the ghetto, the Vilna ghetto, with his mother. His father sent to the labour camp. Him and his mother managed to escape and go and hide in a convent. Then they're all forced back to the ghetto. The father sent back. They're then sent back to another camp. And his dad smuggles him out in a sack. We're going to look at this picture in a minute that displays this. His mother and him survived, but sadly his father's shot in Ponary. So we can see he's a child genius. There's lots to discuss. I would scaffold questions with the students. And again, if you were just going to focus on one image, and perhaps this one, self-portrait, so some questions that hopefully the students would already be asking. Quite often I don't show the titles, I want them to come up with what they can see and start almost being like detectives, deciphering the symbols that he uses in his work. And I just put in this one photo to see the story also shows that he sees his best friend being shot in the ghetto just for running. And again, someone's already talked earlier on about the idea of guilt of survivors or the voices of children. So a lot of the time in his paintings is this sort of surrender figure. Why did he survive when 1.5 million children don't survive? And him and his mother then spend 3 years in Landsberg DP camp, another opportunity to maybe talk about camps that students wouldn't know about. And then we can see how he expresses life after is probably even harder. So the idea of the journey, students are already looking maybe for the sort of destroyed Star of David, representing the destruction of Jewish faith, culture. But then this idea of family, only he and his mother survived, so they can maybe think about their families, what people in their families, how to memorialize. And in his pictures, there's always hope. On the far right, there's a little branch, the idea of hope. To his more recent paintings, I've heard speaking, Yad Vashem, he's an amazing artist, he's still painting now. So again, maybe this would be one painting that you could use. And there's a lot that you could break down from here. The boats turned into Noah's Ark. The students are starting to look now for symbols. So we've got the blackbird. They might not know that the blackbird's pecking away at, man's sort of sits prayer shawl. They don't notice the way the bird of peace on the right is quite an ugly bird of peace. Why is the P screwed down? So lots of themes that they can start discussing. Again, more obviously here, they can start seeing that hope is physically tied down. So what is Samuel saying about hope? And now just going to look at another artist, so a very different experience. Sorry, I should have said I did say Sammy was Jewish. Haya Stoica, so she's a Roma Sinti. She's the fifth of 6 children, part of a Roma family of the Levari tribe, traditionally horse traders, in Austria. In 1941, her father's deported to Dachau, then murdered at Hartheim Castle Euthanasia Centre. Her and the rest of the family go to Auschwitz-Birkenau, then her and her mother and sister to Ravensbrück. And she's liberated age 12 from Bergen-Belsen. And there's only the 6 of them survive out of a family of 200. And they return to Austria, but again, no acknowledgement of the Roma experience. And people are aware that Roma experience was maybe not talked about so much earlier on, it was taboo, being recognised. In 1986, she starts to paint at the age of 56. 3 major themes in her sort of paintings, I would say. The light pictures, pre-war life, dark pictures showing the time in the Holocaust, being oppressed. And again, like the theme of Samuel about the difficult return life after. So again, even I work quite a lot with students that haven't got English as a first language, you know, so the visual images of the life before we can discuss, just conscious of my time. You know, the pictures are now getting darker, you know, the Nazis are now stamping on the sunflowers, you know, the trauma of being in a camp. If they remember Mama in the pink dress, this is Mama now. You know, they can again see the bird. They've connected the bird with Samuel Bach's interpretation of the bird to no colour whatsoever. To then move to Ravensbrück. Again, she's a naive artist. So it might encourage students that don't feel they've got artistic skills, but we can see the feelings, you know, straight away. There's no words needed to describe what life's like now, and all the birds are sort of turned into the barbed wire. To then life after. Again, on first glance, it might be very colourful, but immediately, you know, the children are now trained students, they can recognise the birds. They might be flying away to sort of a picture of life after, back living in the traditional lifestyle. But again, birds are grey on the horizon, there is colour. The landscape, again, sort of scarred, you know, so this idea of using landscape. I'll just scroll through some student responses. I think I've still got a minute. I'm sure someone will tell me if I haven't. And then this idea that I think it's a really concentrated way for students to learn. You know, they physically made something they're proud of. You know, I can see them taking photographs to share with people of the work they've created. Again, they bring their own influence. So obviously the idea of the students seeing Banksy's work, you know, so it's open. This was the last day of working on March the 19th for a Yom HaShoah Memorial Lantern project. Hopefully it'll happen next year. You can see the idea of the bird pecking away. To some students responding to, you know, the Roma Sinti style of life. Again, you know, the decay of the sunflower. And I'll just finish quickly on the idea of always try and exhibit work, and survivors are so supportive. So Dr. Martin Stern, I work a lot at this college in Ashton, sixth form. After 10 years, we had a massive celebration of their work in the gallery, and it was extended longer. Again, an event in Edinburgh for the Holocaust Memorial Day at Parliament, Janine Webber, and making memorial lanterns that represent survivors. The lovely Harry Bibbring I've worked for years with, but sadly passed away. Same with Rudy Oppenheimer. Events like in Manchester Town Hall, so mayors and everything. Bolton, I do a lot of festival projects. And then this idea of the ripples of learning. So a calendar we've made last year. So the idea that these would be around school, you know, constant reminders of events that would happen, featuring students' artwork, postcards we regularly do. And then also relationships with universities, teaching teachers are obviously going to be then teaching the next students, and a chance for them to make their own art resource. I have finished, and hopefully in time. Thank you very much. I shall stop sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that, Caroline. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to our third panellist, Leah Sauter from the University of Haifa, and her paper is entitled Threads of History, Sewing as Resistance During the Holocaust. So Leah, over to you.
Myself. Talking about a different kind of art, an art that's kind of more utilitarian, which is of course sewing and textile art. And of course these garments are worn every day, but they're also something that because they're being made by a person, take an artistic skill. So the pieces that I'm going to be sharing were all made during the Holocaust. Most of them are from the USHMM collection, and one's from the Museum of Jewish Heritage, where I was just recently interning. I'm not sure if you can see my screen, hopefully you can. But the first garment I wanted to share is one that I find particularly interesting because of its connection to kind of contemporary clothing of the time. So when we think about Holocaust era clothing, it's often clothing of dehumanization, prisoner uniforms, Stars of David, stuff like this. And this garment takes literally a garment of dehumanization, the prisoner uniform, and turns it into something that can provide comfort. It's a brassiere, so it was, you know, it's something that many women wear to make themselves more comfortable, but it's also something that's rehumanizing, and this was actually a gift from one prisoner to another. So it's one prisoner helping another rehumanize themselves with a garment. And so this this bra was made for a woman named Margaret Simon Hantman in the Sakish Kudova camp in 1944 by a fellow prisoner. It's made of 4 pieces of fabric that have been, all of the shaping is done with something called darts, which can help to save on some fabric and some time in working with the garment. And much of the stitching shows an enormous amount of skill. It's closed at the back with these very neat loops, and you can see that there are 2 different buttons that are used, which shows, you know, someone's looking to find things to make this garment with, or trading for pieces to make this garment, which of course could be, you know, it could be quite dangerous in this setting. And one thing I wanted to look at with this bra in particular is how much it resembles kind of clothing worn at the time under normal circumstances. So I have it compared to a bra that's held at the Underpinnings Museum collection that was made in 1941 in England by the Symington Corset Company, which had been around since the 19th century. It was a very popular brand. And although obviously the materials are very different and a lot of the techniques show, you know, the ability to take more time and, you know, have some more control over what you're using, the shaping and the way that it's designed are actually very similar to each other, which to me shows that, you know, the person who's making this bra in a labor camp setting is remembering the clothing that she wore before and is using kind of how that clothing from before the war was made and how it made her feel to make something that feels familiar. The second garment I want to turn to is a prisoner uniform skirt, which was made by Hannah Brummel in Auschwitz in October 1944. It was like basically all clothing that was given to prisoners in Auschwitz, it didn't fit. And so what she did was she cut off the bottom and used the bottom to make these 2 pockets, which of course could be extremely useful in a concentration camp setting to, you know, carry personal belongings close to the body. But then she also added darts around the back and side of the waist, which would allow it to fit more closely around her waist to be more comfortable. She also added a waistband inside so that the harsh textile wasn't directly against her skin. And it also provides some shape. It becomes something that's not just kind of a square garment, but something that actually fits more like skirts did at this time during kind of regular life. And then moving away from something made out of prisoner uniform cloth, I want to show you this sweater that was made again as a gift for Blanka Winkler in Riga when she was a slave laborer. As you can see, it's an extremely intricate design. And of course, this was done without a pattern. Knitting was very popular at this time and patterns were cheap and readily available. But of course, this was not a time where you could get a pattern. So this was all done by memory, which shows a really enormous amount of skill. It's also made from yarn that was salvaged. So it was, she found a pair of socks, unraveled the yarn, and then a fellow prisoner made the sweater out of this yarn. And I wanted to show you for comparison images from popular patterns at the time. So again, you can see that this was made with in mind garments that would have been worn by these people before the war. So it's, you know, keeping familiarity, like self-rehumanization, and also an altruistic rehumanization. And then lastly, I'd like to turn to this garment, which I actually had the pleasure of viewing myself at the Museum of Jewish Heritage this winter. It's a blouse made by partisan fighter Chaya Porras, who was a member of the Nakam partisan group in Lithuania. She made this blouse originally for her sister, Rachel, who was a nurse in the ghetto hospital. Peasant blouses like this were actually very stylish at the time. It's something that I think today we often associate with like the 1970s, but they were very popular in the 1930s and 1940s as well. This is made really quite simply. A lot of peasant blouses are styled after shifts and chemises, which were 18th and 19th century underwear. So it has just two simple front and back pieces. The sleeves are gathered, which make very small pleats so that the arms kind of stand up. And then it's closed with a drawstring, which again makes really pretty pleats around the neckline. And of course, Chaya found many, many different colors of thread to embroider this blouse. There's 3 rows of embroidery on the neckline in blue, yellow, and red. The yellow's very difficult to see. It's quite faded now. But it's an extremely intricate embroidery pattern. She has 4 or 5 different colors of thread, all of which she would have had to find. And of course, she designed the pattern herself. And so when she was giving this to her sister, it was a gift. It was something that was meant to make her sister feel beautiful. And her sister was soon after taken to Ponar and shot. Like most victims in Ponar, she was forced to strip before she was killed. And a friend of Chaya's was a forced laborer who was sorting clothing. And because this blouse was so distinctive, she recognized it and stole it from the pile of clothing, which of course is very dangerous and could have easily gotten her killed. This friend then returned the blouse to Chaya, and Chaya wore it for the remainder of the war as a talisman for her sister, as an act of remembrance. And she also really kept it in good condition. She, you know, did everything she could to keep it wearable. There are patches under each arm that are very neat, and something else that she did to make it continue to be wearable is she darned over parts of the patch, which make it a lot stronger. So this is just showing she's doing everything in her power to continue to be able to wear this as memory to her sister. as someone who sews myself, I think that clothing can be a really personal and intimate way of connecting with history. And it's often something that is sometimes overlooked because it's not seen kind of as mainstream art, but it can be really meaningful for people. And these garments can be, very interesting to look at, very interesting to work with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. Such an interesting presentation. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next panelist here, which is Sylvia Papier from Jagiellonian University. Her paper is entitled Survivor Holograms as a Museum and Educational Object. So Sylvia, over to you.
Elizabeth, can you see my screen?
Yes, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So the primary aim of my project is to explore and analyze the new strategy of Holocaust witnessing in the digital age. In a time when different measures are designed and applied in order to extend the physical presence of survivors, my research focuses on the turn from the first-hand witness speaking and performing into holographic, from bodily presence into virtual witnessing, which gains more and more attention of the scholars nowadays. The key object of my PhD project is the Shaw Foundation Dimensions in Testimony project, launched by Shaw Foundation and the USC Institute for Creative Technologies Design. According to the director of the foundation, Stephen Smith, the reason for the project was that, frustrated by the lack of human dialogue with digital content in the interactive era, and afraid that conversation between survivors and young people will be lost forever, the director of the Consistence Display decided to overcome the time barrier, proposing a new form of presenting the survivor in the form of a hologram. So, as I said, this project is an initiative aimed at registering survivors in the form of 3D holograms, which are then made available either to institutions as part of museum exhibitions or to schools as part of an educational project in the field of disseminating knowledge and teaching about the Holocaust. This project aimed to make survivor accessible to everyone, and as a result, it suggests that every Holocaust museum and center will be able to obtain such holograms for its collections. Also, it is worth to mention that Shaw Foundation recently piloted the Dimensions in Testimony educational program focused just on this particular project. But what this project exactly is? As you can read on the project webpage, it is an interactive biography to give people the opportunity to have conversational experience with survivors of the Holocaust and other witnesses to history far into the future. Each specially recorded testimony enables viewers to ask questions of the survivor and hear responses in real-time, lifelike conversation. So no doubt can be said that it is the first such advanced question and answer program used in the narrative of the Holocaust, which is the original answer to technological development which has been made in recent decades. And most importantly, allows recipients on that kind of contact with a survivor of the Holocaust that has not previously could be achieved by using any recording or data storage medium. The Shaw Foundation Dimensions in Testimony project is even more complicated research object, the description of which should reflect on many levels. For example, on the status and position of the survivor in the digital age, on how the transfer of memory takes place here, but also consideration of the issues of institutionalization and technologization of testimony, the place where holograms are presented, how they affect recipients, how holograms act as a tool for prolonging survivors' existence, and finally, what ethical choices are associated with implementing of such project. In addition, it is not only an educational or performative tool to connect with the survivor and to preserve memory, but also a tool that extends the presence of survivor. This project changes our recipients' time relations with people and artifacts because the prototypes of these holograms, prototypes, I mean the real survivors, may first simultaneously exist in reality with holographic representations. Second, may pass away of Stanley Bernard, who died in 2019, or three, may be reproduced. Therefore, we are dealing here with the tension between presence and absence of survivors. But what I would like to shortly propose today is just one aspect of this project. So I mean the way holograms are nowadays exhibited and presented, especially in museum space. As German researcher Steffi de Jong notes, she writes that the mere placement of testimonies in the museum space can be understood as a direct response to the calls to listen to the voices of the survivors and treat them with respect. Writing about testimonies and strategies of presenting them in museums, de Jong considers the survivors' recordings presented in exhibitions in two main aspects. First, in relation to other artifacts exhibited in the museum. The second, as museum objects adapted in various ways to current exhibition practices. As museum objects, in what terms describe them, how to create them, what is the potential of those who testify in this project, how is the visual materials are produced and kept by the institutions. As we all know, there are obviously various existing practices to create survivors. De Jong wrote, I quote, "Some institutions place them prominently in the main galleries, while others hide them in dark corners or deep inside the data of computer stations. In some museums, the stories can others show extracts of video interviews. Some show professional looking, almost artistic films on high-definition television screens, while in other, the video are mere amateurish. Some let actors read out interview sequences, others have kept the original recordings." I finish quote. The Illinois Holocaust Museum and the Educational Center in Skokie was the institution initiating the presentation of holograms, and the first survivor recorded in this way was Pinchas Guter in 2004. And also his hologram, among other survivors, is still presented in a separate space in the aforementioned museum. But there are more and more of the American museums getting them for their exhibition. In Europe, they were presented only in two places, for example, in Stockholm or in Berlin. In case of holograms, if they are presented in the museum, especially they are located in separate rooms, mostly placing in auditorium on the stage. In particular, this brings to mind theatrical stage. In addition, the scene itself, often used as a place for the presentation of the testimony, immediately brings to mind association with the staging the story, acting, reenactment. It becomes a convenient place displaying the figure of an engaging meeting between the survivor and the audience. Regarding another researcher, Tony Kushner, the price we pay for using even in the most conscious and careful way testimonies at the museum historical exhibition is a loss of the singularity of the testimony of a specific witness who tries to give meaning to his life through a story. Is it the same with this project? Here, perhaps I see a space for such projects as UST Shah Foundation, whose creators made an effort to reconnect the historical event with specific voices, those who can testify. They set themselves the goal of preserving the survivor's body and individual experience. However, it is again on a mass scale. And the last thing I want to show you, because I don't have more time, I want to share with you is the survey, the result of the survey on the audience from the Shah Foundation side. The survey was done in the Illinois Holocaust Museum, if I remember correctly. From the graph, we can read that hologram presentation fascinates the recipients, catches the eyes, and focuses attention more than previously used techniques of presenting witnesses. Secondly, this new display technologies enables the recipients and school students to experience new, more interactive and engaging experience of testimony and the space in which they are located. In this context, really important seems to be the performative presence of the survivor or a survivor hologram, and the second, how the stories is narrated and curated and staged by museum curators. Finally, this form of presentation enables a better understanding of history and thus strengthens the affective reception of the story through a sense of physical contact with another person, creates a specific kind of relationship with the one who
Okay, thank you very much for that. Thank you. Okay, so we're now going to move on to our next panellist, Barnabas Balint from Magdalen College at the University of Oxford. And his paper is entitled Go In With Your Eyes Open. Oh, sorry. Yes, Go In With Your Eyes Open, Approaching Survivor Testimony in the Classroom. So over to you, Barnabas. Thank you.
Thank you. I will share a PowerPoint. Hopefully you can all see that. There we go. Wonderful. So, in a recent conversation convened by the Holocaust Educational Trust, Holocaust survivor Paul Schwid, pictured here, urged those speaking about the Holocaust to school groups to go in with your eyes open and to finish with a smile, not a scowl. Reflecting on his own experiences, he warns that each school group needed to be approached differently, being cognizant of their varying levels of prior knowledge about the Holocaust. Paul's comments raise important issues about how we use survivor testimony in educational settings. Survivors are arguably the ultimate source of Holocaust memory. From them, we learn not only about the event itself, but also about how the individual perceived it, how they understood their part within it, and its impact on their later life. Such testimony, however, also brings with it many methodological challenges, not least regarding the limitations of a single perspective. Oral histories, therefore, have had a profound impact on Holocaust memory and research, both in academic and public settings. This presentation will explore these issues around using survivor testimony with school groups, examining different methods of contextualizing, understanding, and building upon their words. It will question how hearing survivors' testimony frames students' perceptions of the Holocaust as a whole, and how it generates a certain type of Holocaust memory. Furthermore, looking towards the future, it will consider how digital forms of testimony like the USC Shoah Foundation will impact this work. It will explore these issues by drawing on both academic studies on oral history and my own personal experiences of running school visits with survivors. Combining academic perspectives with contemporary practice of the UK educational settings, this paper will complicate our understanding of how we can approach survivor testimony in education. Oral histories have had a long association with Holocaust research, from the immediate post-war interviews of David Boda in 1946 to the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive that we've just heard about. Theoretical scholarly frameworks about oral histories and how to approach them have also developed over the past decades, accelerated in part by advances in technology. Furthermore, Holocaust survivors like Paul, who share their testimony with school groups or record oral history interviews, have become central to popular and education-based perceptions of the Holocaust. In this paper, I'll focus on one such event that I organised, the Holocaust Memorial Conference at the University of Exeter in 2019. At this event, we welcomed over 200 secondary school students from sixth forms and schools across the Southwest to the university for an afternoon conference in advance of Holocaust Memorial Day. After opening speeches that explained the context and the structure for the day, students heard the testimony of Holocaust survivor Marla Trivich, whose experience included hiding, ghettoization, slave labour, and typhus before her liberation by British forces at Bergen-Belsen. After her testimony and a brief question and answer session with Marla, students attended seminars from academics and expert speakers. The conference closed with a reflection session at the end, which encouraged students to think about the contemporary relevance of the Holocaust and of their next steps, as well as to complete an evaluation form, short quotes from which I'll use extensively here. When Marla spoke at the conference, she did so within a curated and education-focused context. Opening the event, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the institution commented that by raising awareness of the Holocaust, this conference is an important opportunity for us as a community to engage with and learn about one of the darkest times in human history, and to take inspiration from the resilience of those who lived through it. The focus on learning and on being influenced by the event continued after Marla's testimony, with seminars exploring the broader histories of the Holocaust and putting her individual story into the context of the Holocaust as a whole. When students reflected on how these seminars had complemented Marla's testimony, their comments focused mainly around the ideas of knowledge and of comprehension. They helped well educate me on the topic, said one student, while another, who described the seminars as extremely gripping, commented that it had aided me in understanding what really happened. Contextualizing Marla's oral history within an academic and educative environment left students with an understanding of what they'd learned as a piece of true history. When one student used the phrase "what really happened," they attributed a sense of authenticity to it, an authenticity that for them grew out of a compelling and stimulating combination of personal experience and academic history. Notwithstanding the context of Marla's testimony, her oral history itself had a powerful impact on students' perceptions of the Holocaust, framing their understanding and generating highly personalised and individual Holocaust memories. Reflecting on the conference as a whole, students overwhelmingly highlighted Marla's contribution as central, enabling them to develop an emotional and a personal connection with the past. This echoes scholarship on oral histories that puts the emotional elements front and centre. In his groundbreaking work, for example, Alessandro Portelli argued that testimonies tell us less about events than they do about their meanings. This has been worked in similar works such as Jeffrey Chandler, who spoke about direct encounters, and Lawrence Langer in terms of anguished memory. Indeed, students' comments are punctuated with references to the emotive experience of hearing a survivor. Her testimony is often described as moving and emotional, with students perceiving themselves as having benefited personally from hearing their words. As we've seen, these subjective and feeling-based comments highlight areas of the historical narrative that oral history has long been associated with. By engaging with Marla's testimony as an emotional experience, people at the conference enacted Portelli's meaning-based understanding of the past. For them, oral history offered a way of understanding the Holocaust through a human lens. One student commented that the conference and the seminar gave me a real insight into what it was like for those who were trapped in a situation that it's hard to even think about. Relating to Marla on a human level, students broke down the barriers between history and the present, humanizing a past they would have only otherwise understood through text and picture. This raises the problem articulated by Jürgen Malthaus in his work Approaching the Holocaust and the Auschwitz Survivor. Despite their evocative power, the distance is the truly understanding an event like the Holocaust from the perspective of someone who experienced it surely cannot be bridged. No matter how far the emotions conveyed by getting face to face with a survivor went, they could get nowhere near the sense of loss and trauma of the Holocaust. Engaging critically with students' responses therefore reveals how they perceived learning about the Holocaust and oral history as an emotional experience, with notions of proximity and of personal understanding. The powerful pedagogical potential of oral histories has not gone unnoticed in scholarship. Exploring this, Christina Llewellyn and Sharon Ann Cook argued for the use of oral histories promotes what they termed a peace pedagogy, humanized, transformative, and effective learning and teaching. This is achieved by confronting students with the traumatic experience of marginalized individuals in the evocative narrative form of an oral history. Central to this is the idea that testimonies have a capacity to inspire empathy, deep listening, and collective memory. Indeed, arguing for the synergies between video testimony and oral history, Mary Marshall Clark asserted that the recovery of memory by creating personal narratives promotes dialogue for the purpose of responding ethically. Acts of listening, Clark asserted, give us the grounds upon which to establish ourselves as members of communities of knowledge, with a duty to respond to stories of suffering and their causes. Importantly, these arguments stress how the emotiveness of oral history, though important in itself, brings about the capacity for listeners to contribute to public understandings and attitudes. These elements shone through strongly in students' responses to the conference. As explored earlier, the context and environment within which students heard Marla's testimony is very important. Both the physical environment of the university and the contextual speeches and seminars shaped students' perceptions of what they were hearing and how they should think about it. The Deputy Vice-Chancellor's comments that we should engage with and learn about history, as well as take inspiration from it, set the scene for a multifaceted day. Indeed, students often interpreted the event as both a deeply educational experience and an opportunity to be inspired by her testimony. Thinking about their return to school, one student commented that I now have a better motivation towards studying Weimar Germany. Similarly, one teacher whose responsibility it was to create the annual Holocaust Memorial Display said that having attended this conference, I'll now look at how to design the display from a different perspective. Motivated by what they had heard, these attendees took on personal initiatives in response to hearing the Holocaust oral history. For them, Marla's testimony was not only a way of better understanding the past, it was also a source of inspiration for the present. This is complicated by the fact that this event took part only 2 weeks before Holocaust Memorial Day, where a time where narratives of learning from genocide for a safer future were abundant. One student commented that it's a really important topic for our generation, while others, a teacher, spoke about how it had inspired them to ask students tough questions about the contemporary relevance. Linking oral history to notions of contemporary relevance shows not only the impact of educative and commemorative context, but also the special type of Holocaust memory that it generates. Ideas of a peace pedagogy appear here, yet within the broader picture of how the day was structured and Marla's testimony contextualized. Oral histories in an educational setting therefore taken on an extra dimension than they do in scholarship. In pedagogy, not only do they complicate and humanize narratives of the past, they also create direct and personal links between face-to-face individuals, links with the ability to inspire and motivate action. The relational and emotional elements of oral histories and survivor testimonies have long been understood and are widely used. The challenge, however, is what Paul Schweerd noted when he asked us to go in with our eyes open and to finish with a smile, not a scowl. Survivor testimony in education carries with it immense power to connect students to the past, to get them thinking about the present, and to inspire them for the future. How we present survivor testimonies in educational settings is therefore important. Thinking about emotion, about how students relate to individual histories, and about the personal lessons and interpretations that they might take from them must therefore be at the forefront of our minds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barnabas. Okay, so we're now over to our final panellists. We have a joint paper here. So we have Alexandra Szabo from Brandeis University and Ambrose Hernandi, and their paper is entitled Understanding a Holocaust Survivor Through the Language of Film. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First, I'm going to share my screen and the PPT to make sure that I don't get stuck meanwhile, because there's going to be a piece of the film in there that we can watch all together. So I want to make sure that will be okay. I'm hoping everyone can see the screen, right? The PPT. Great. Okay, so I am Alexandra, and this is Ambrose, my husband, and he is a documentary filmmaker, and I'm researching Hungarian Holocaust survivors. We started working together on this project that we're talking about today in 2018 in New York. filming Randolph L. Brehem, a Hungarian survivor, and also an esteemed historian, political scientist. This project unfortunately came to a halt with Randy's death a year, well, not exactly a whole year after we started filming in 2019, but we still have the raw footage with us, both physically and also in thoughts. So we're constantly thinking about what to do with this film. And that's why we're bringing this to the workshop today. So we will conclude with several questions and hope to get some insights from you as well.
Yes, so when I got accepted to the new school in New York, the documentary studies program, as a son of a Holocaust survivor who barely talks about his personal aftermath of the Holocaust, I decided to make a film about an old friend of my father, Randolph Brehem, who committed his whole life to researching the Holocaust and actually talking about it. As a 96-year-old esteemed professor at the time, when we started filming, the questions of legacy loomed large. The main theme was not the Holocaust in its classical sense, but how such an event still has an impact in 2018 or in 2020 also. Besides Randy's lifetime professional devotion to the topic of Holocaust, we found out that there was a mundane level of the experiential trauma which revealed itself in his everyday life.
So while filming, we began thinking how we can offer something new together with some of the research that I was doing in New York at the time. And we wanted to have a new format of filming, a new format of documentary film that can somehow cross path with academic research. The first conclusion that we arrived at was how this new kind of form, new kind of documentary filmmaking can offer an entirely new approach to understanding and learning about Holocaust survivors through the language of film. And we came up with two perspectives. One is the mode of expression is different, and two, the interpretation of trauma is also very different. So looking at the first point, the mode of expression in Ambrosch's shots is different because of its observational documentarian style. This made us realize that survivors are just as used to the testimony format that we have already encountered today with Barnabas's and others' presentations, so that the survivors themselves are also used to this testimony format. And this is something that Ambrosch was aiming to get out of, and I as a researcher was also curious how far we can go with this. And while this observational method is a somewhat slower method of inquiry, its main strength is that it is not set up. So there's no direct Q&A situation, there's no lack of full expression, nor lack of time. So there's no sensation of being in a hurry or jumping in between thoughts when the memory process is happening for a survivor. And of course, there are no interviewer problems that I'm sure all of us have encountered in research before. So basically, what happens in the film or in the footages is that the present situation that Randy was in took him back to his own past memory, and then the process of reconnecting with the thought immediately became organic. And we're going to show a scene where hopefully you will see for yourself that how this happens.
Yeah, so especially for the first couple of occasions when we started filming, it was really hard to start to film with him. He was constantly looking into the camera and talk to the camera. And he really needed a plan every time we visited him about what we are going to shoot exactly and how. So it was really hard to push through the observational, slower pace style we wanted for the film.
But let us show you how we did manage to get over this with Randy. Here are some scenes, but this is raw footage, so not professional editing. Please bear in mind.
So the only book, Mary, in the book review section that might be of interest is by Michael Beschloss.
I saw that. I was about to read the review. Yes.
Okay. Don't order it.
Don't order it?
No.
Because?
Don't order it. Okay, getting ready. Mesdames et messieurs, le dîner est servi.
Oui.
Before we were liberated, the five of us who were together took a solemn oath. Never ever leave the house without a piece of bread in your pocket. Even to the bathroom or take the vehicle.
So through these series of everyday events, some scenes strongly stick out. As for me, this scene is actually very strong, and not only because I was there, even if I see it on the screen. And that's how we can visualize a new interpretation method of trauma, not only because this is a more allowing format to understand based on what and how trauma is linked to specific events. For example, this scene came to Randy talking about the bread in his pocket through having dinner together. But as we can see, it's self-reflexive as well in nature. And this is what I find tremendous, that different documentaries also have this quality. And now I'm talking about documentary films that are not the old school interview-based documentaries, but those with new methods of filming, such as, here I have two other examples, The Granny Project and The Euphoria of Being, both discussing Holocaust survivors.
Yes, so about the film and what we wanted to do actually. So the film wanted to depict Randy's two main characteristics, his systematic thinking and his constant drive of remaining active, which on a deeper level comes from his early labor camp experience, the importance of order and discipline. According to the papers, Alexandra mentioned, maybe you mentioned already.
No, so sorry. The basis of the research at that point was in psychological and trauma studies. And namely, I was referring to, when I was doing the research with Randy, to the Shammai papers of how camp survivors, but mainly labor service survivors have this workaholic attitude throughout their life.
Yes, basically the unstoppable effort of remaining active is due to the reaction of the camp experience to keep on going, otherwise you perish. In Randy's weekdays, even at such an exceptional age, this was absolutely visible as he was still writing, editing, co-publishing, and even working in the household. So as Alexandra already mentioned, our research and project plan sadly validated itself because Randy's condition suddenly got really bad just a couple of days before his farewell lecture at the City University of New York in late 2018, which would have led to his retirement. 2 weeks later, he passed away with the approaching feeling of an assignmentless life. So this all led us to the question of the possibility of filming Holocaust survivors. How can we finish this film, which would really need more material to release it in the style we started to film it, so this observational style. Therefore, we were thinking about how the film, how to film this topic, the Holocaust in general, at some point without any survivors left.
And just to really conclude and close off, so this is a methodological approach, but we also have the practical question of this film and our own unfinished project. And we didn't even mention that we are missing out on the life of a historian and his work. We have been in touch with Ferenc Lotso, who's here with us listening today, and he has been researching Berhand's papers and unpublished memoir, and we are still thinking of more practical ways that this project could continue, where academic research and film could be one. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you for that. Okay, so thank you so much to all of our panelists. What we're going to do now is move and hopefully answer some questions. So we've got about 30 minutes in which we can do that. So we've had quite a lot come through, which is really great to see. So what I'll do is I'll select a few, I'll try and go around the different panelists so everyone gets some questions in. So if we start then, so there was a question to Alexandra Birch from Rami. I'm not too sure if he's still in the chat. Are you familiar with Fantasy in Gelb, a programmatic symphonic poem composed in the Kovno ghetto? Is his question.
Yes, yeah, I've seen it and worked with, I guess, like fragments of the score. But it's for much larger orchestration than I usually deal with. I usually deal with things that are just for violin and piano. But yes, also it works with that kind of non-text commemoration, right? It's not, I think it does have an underlying poem associated with it, but it's not a text piece.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is to Caroline from Hannah. In your work as an educator using artistic sources, has anything really surprised you about the children's responses?
Well, yeah, children are, I think, always underestimated, but maybe even by some of their teachers. So, I mean, the thing I love is that they come up with things that maybe some student hasn't said before when they're looking at something in one of the paintings that speaks to them. And again, they understand there's no right or wrong answer. And then I'll often say, well, I'm going to use that when I next speak, because I hadn't even thought of that myself. I think also maybe because I said it is open to all students of all abilities, so you always get at the end of a day or a project that teachers are really pleased with students that maybe haven't always responded. One young man that stays with me had autism, and the teacher said, well, we'll just see what happens, and he was very engaged. He sat on his own, but when he finished his drawing, he just spoke to me for about 10 minutes about it, which apparently was quite unusual. And he really related, his drawing was somebody being faded away, and that's how he felt. So I think it's open for all connections, if that sort of answers the question.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so the third question then I'm going to pose to Leah, and it's from Maden. So are you familiar with a travelling exhibition entitled Stitching History from the Holocaust?
I was not until she said the link, but I just took a quick look at it and it looks really interesting. There's also, it looks like it has some similar things to works with a British dress historian, Lucy Adlington, who is currently in the research stages of a book on fashion during the Holocaust, which I believe would be the first book-length work that would be fully on that and not simply on clothing during World War II. She also wrote a fiction book called The Red Ribbon about seamstresses in Auschwitz.
Oh, interesting, thank you. So the next one then is to Sylvia. So Helen Hyde, who I'm assuming is joining us from the National Holocaust Centre and Museum over in the UK. She's asked if you're familiar with the Forever Project, which is obviously a similar programme to New Dimensions in Testimony. So one of the things I thought then was, would you be comparing your project on Dimensions in Testimony with any other similar projects, such as the Forever Project, or are you just focusing on the one project?
So I'm writing, in particular, I'm writing just on this project, but I know the Forever Project, and I also spoke about it with John Salter. And I also thought about like interviewing her for my research. So maybe I will compare these two projects, but I'm not so familiar with the British one, let's say.
Okay. Okay, so our next question is for Barnabas from Chris. Have the past few months led you to reflect on how this experience by students would translate to a less impressive environment than a university, such as a home environment? Would something be lost, do you think?
It's a very interesting question. It's something that I think Holocaust educators have been grappling with over the past few months. I know at the Holocaust Educational Trust, which organised the event I spoke about with Paul, there has been a transition to online events, and that event that I went to was a small group coffee morning style discussion where there were about 15 or so of us with a Holocaust survivor, and able to have that close contact was incredibly. It was still incredibly powerful. Of course, there are major differences between that and a face-to-face actual physical meeting with someone, not least about ideas of the personal connection, opportunities for individual personal discussions and things like that. So I think we've certainly lost one thing. We've lost the potential to inspire hundreds of young people through Holocaust survivors going into schools who've not been able to, and through big projects like the Holocaust Educational Trust's Lessons from Auschwitz project that over the year takes hundreds, if not thousands, of young people to Auschwitz and gets them to hear a Holocaust survivor as part of that project too. But on the other hand, this has opened up opportunities for things that we didn't have before. So students in schools in geographies of the UK that it's incredibly hard to get survivors to, because they're remote, their transport links aren't good. Organisations like the Trust rely completely on the goodwill of survivors and on their ability to go to these places. And students in those locations have, maybe for the first time ever, been able to access this online. So I wouldn't say there's a black and white situation of zero sum loss and gain. Definitely we need to think about what's at the core of the experience, and that's the emotional connection, being able to relate and being able to be inspired. And some things have been lost and some things have been gained.
Thank you. Okay, we've just had a question come in for Alexandra and Ambrush from Ferenc. May I ask, did you perhaps have a short list of the types of things that you had intended to observe while recording? Was there a concrete plan behind how you wished to observe Randy? Was it possible to pre-plan such a project of wishing to document authentic reactions? Alexandra and Ambrush, are you?
Sorry. We were on mute. Sorry. So thank you for the question. So basically the main idea was to start the film with the farewell lecture at the City University of New York, and then go for the more personal footage, and to film in his house, and to film that how can he actually cope with retirement. So we wanted to go into his routine and just be there like a fly on the wall situations, and observe how he is with Maria, his partner, and basically that's all.
Yeah, and actually I was there helping as Ambrush's assistant, and nothing could be pre-planned. Everything just folded out the way it happened. There was once when Ambrush became very slow unpacking the camera, and then I just saw him like telling me to get out of the house, and then I realized, okay, then something is unfolding here. And basically he just left the camera in there, and then we went out of the house to see, you know, how they would talk about us maybe, or within themselves, like, was there anything that Randy wanted to show us but maybe he couldn't, and yeah, so it was all just out of the spur moment how we had these scenes.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Thank you. So our next question goes back to Alexandra Birch, and this one is from Helen. Did Emil compose the piece during the war, and do you know where he did it?
Yes, so it's a piece that was actually composed, as far as I can tell, immediately post-war. The composer unfortunately died before we discovered the work had been donated to the museum, but I reached out to his son when I was doing the research for it, and he seems to have composed this probably in about 1950, which also would have coincided when he found out about the murder of all of his family. He was in Moscow through the whole war. So then he probably found out about his family and wrote this personal commemoration and basically didn't touch it until 1993, at which point he immigrated to Indianapolis and donated this to the very new one-year-old USHMM, and then probably didn't think about it. He also recorded it at the time he donated it, but interestingly, he never mentioned the piece or that he had composed any kind of personal tribute to anybody in his family. So.
Thank you for that. So my next question then is for Leah from Hannah. It seems that sewing was really a way of women reclaiming some aspect of their own individualised identity back. It's really moving. Could you maybe elaborate on this?
Yes, I think that's exactly what sewing these kinds of garments did. Especially if you look at garments like the skirt I showed, it's really making little changes that just give you some control over what you're wearing, some sense of identity. And if you look at things like undergarments, I think it also is acting as re-feminizing. A lot of what was done to dehumanize during the Holocaust also kind of stripped you of your femininity. So taking back some of that by wearing a bra that would give you kind of the shape you were used to, or even taking little tucks in your skirt to give you a waist, is a way of kind of reinforcing I am still human.
Thank you. So the next question then is for Caroline from Barnabas. When students you work with have created artistic responses, what has happened to the artwork afterwards? And what can you tell us about the impact it has had on wider Holocaust memory for the people they've shared it with, their parents or any public exhibitions, for instance?
Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah, all works returned, especially if it's been exhibited. If it's been exhibited in the school, then obviously it's returned. It generally forms part of their portfolios if they're doing it in an art subject. Obviously I work very cross-curricular, so even if it's with religious studies or in English or in history, the work could still be, if they were doing art, would go in their portfolios. A lot of work I do, some of what you saw, like the sculptures and photography responses, are with 16 plus students. So it quite often becomes a catalyst. They're very taken with the subject, want to research other artists, and there's always a way of finding to fit, you know, if they've given 6 themes for their A-level art, you know, there's always emotions or journeys or fractured, or, you know, so it tends to then become the inspiration for, you know, the major project of their A-level pieces, like, you know, the sculpture I might have shown earlier on in the presentation. A lot of my projects, if they're funded, evaluation is compulsory anyway. So we'll be evaluating the teachers as well as the students. Again, teachers that maybe are non-art, would they be encouraged to, you know, maybe include 1 or 2 pieces of the, you know, maybe one of Samuel Bach's. I'm not saying do a whole session, but, you know, particularly like the more religious ones would link him particularly very well with RE teachers. If we have events that family and friends are invited to, quite often parents will come up and tell me how they've, you know, the children have come home and told them that they're very excited. proud to know that survivors may be seeing their piece of work. You know, the mayor stood next to it, all these ideas of it being seen. You know, quite often in school, it might not be a real project. They know that it's going to be seen by other people. Also, as I say, they can educate their peers. And I quite often say to students, when I'm showing them whatever session, whether it's looking at propaganda or whatever the students have responded, you know, that your images might be in my next PowerPoint. So when I go to the next school, your work will be inspiring someone else. So hopefully it's all these ripples that will just keep going on. Hopefully that answers it, Barnabas.
Thank you, Caroline, thank you.
So
our next question then is for Sylvia from Hannah. Can you expand on how these holograms become an audio-visual sensory object within museum settings? What do you think the limitations to these are?
It's a great question, Hannah. Thank you so much for it. So no doubt that meeting with the hologram is a multisensorial experience for the museum audience, and that's for sure. I'm still thinking how to describe this Holocaust survivors holograms in terms of sensory object in the museum. For now, I did just a small insight on listening/speaking with hologram, watching them, and touching. So it's the three main ways of interaction with holograms for now, because I'm still researching on this material. So for the first, listen and watch. First of all, these virtual bodies are able to embody the subject, help to in understanding the survivor story. The story itself, how it is narrated, it's really important. So how the questions are answered, how the story is narrated, what holograms shows us. Some of their, for example, are singing the songs they remember. So how this life-size hologram perform, behave, act with the audience is really, really important for my research. And there's really a lot of strategies used here. So it might, like, I should research all the holograms to show the various strategies, how they act with the audience. The second touch, so in this case, the transparent screen becomes the barrier and the only cognitive space. I understand it as the only cognitive space available to us. This means that we cannot reduce the physical distance between the viewer and the hologram. But in this case, I can tell you, just my friend lastly on the seminar told me that, for example, he experienced the holograms in some museum that the hologram started to speak when someone touches the hand of the hologram. So again, there are really different various how to act with the holograms. In this case, there is no like touching hands or something like this. And more on the limits. So it's the first was the distance I said, and the second, there are limits of the hologram's understanding of questions. For example, there were some conversations that they are recorded that someone asked holograms, for example, what the weather is today, and to check if there will be any answer for this question. And hologram answered, rephrase the question, please, or remember, I'm just a hologram. So in the memory of the hologram, there are some answers that some questions that, you know, they cannot answer on them. So yeah, for now, I can just answer like this.
Thanks, Sylvia, thank you. Okay, so the next question is for Barnabas from Alison, and is probably something that concerns many of us. What do you think the future of Holocaust education will look like when survivors are no longer able to contribute themselves?
Yes, you're right. It's a big question, and I think there's two things that I want to talk about in response to this. The first is on the importance of documenting a documentary and testimony collections. So things like what Sylvia's been talking about, the USGC Shoah Foundation, but then also other institutions like the Gathering the Voices up in Scotland that works on transmitting testimony, and also things like the Wiener Library in the UK, and us as researchers and educators as well. These are incredibly important, especially when they're made public and open to people so that they're more accessible, because ultimately those are going to be the sources and the elements that we're relying on to educate people about the Holocaust in the future. But I think it's also important to, secondly, think about the long-term legacy of Holocaust survivors and of hearing the people who are hearing oral testimonies at the moment firsthand, and what that will have in the future. Seeing how inspired students at the events that I've been to have been at hearing from survivors and meeting survivors, I can be fairly confident that we're growing a generation of young people who will grow up having heard this experience, and hopefully having felt something and then be inspired by it as well. There was a survey done by the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust in the UK that runs Holocaust Memorial Day back in 2016 that showed that 70% of people who attended an event for Holocaust Memorial Day felt that they were more aware about causes and organisations that help stop genocide, and that also about the causes of genocide. And moreover, and this is the even more impressive finding of that survey, was that 93% of people who attended events felt that they wanted to take some sort of action, and that they would take some sort of action. And so I think, of course, that will only last one generation. For the rest, we do need to rely on other elements like recorded testimonies. But for this one, I think we shouldn't discount the long-term impact of what is clearly an incredibly inspired generation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so our next question is for Alexandra Birch from Chris. Can music convey an experience such as Emil Leland by itself, or does it rely, in your view, on a supportive text or discussion? Can one share in it fully by listening, or is playing an integral part of entering into his experience?
I'm so glad for this question. It kind of hits on a lot of points in my research more broadly. So I think, first of all, you definitely don't have to play music to access its meaning. And I think part of what's so nice about that is that it can be used in a variety of things, like in a museum setting, in a concert setting, in a classroom setting. And what's great about that as well is that, if you're talking about, for example, a piece about the Holocaust, a performer might understand more of the performer type aspects of the piece and still understand the soul of the person who wrote it, I think, and have a really personal connection to the composer. But at the same time, a Holocaust historian might understand more about the symbolism of the piece than even a performer would. So you kind of get two sides or three sides of the piece by, different people looking at it. So I think that's really fantastic. One of the things about non-text music, I say compared to choral music or things like that, which is typically printed with the text in a program or some kind, you have access to the text, is that it's helpful in these kind of programs to submit even a 1 or 2 sentence thing, just to give people a general idea of the aesthetic of what they might be listening to. For example, I think it'd be very jarring to have some foray or some pastoral type music and then have this Holocaust piece in the program. I think that'd be extremely jarring experience, just because they also don't thematically match, right? It would be a bit like going to, see a museum that had paintings from different eras all mixed up. It would be extremely jarring. However, I do think that you see, and this is kind of what gets into how I've been programming these works, you see a lot of kind of what I've been referring to very pejoratively as re-ghettoized concerts, which are, let's do a Holocaust commemoration concert and that's where these works belong. Or let's put these pieces into a classical music classroom and teach them as kind of sad Holocaust music. And I think that really does a tremendous disservice to these composers, because it situates their validity as composers on their victimhood, rather than that they are in and of themselves good composers. So I've been making an effort to simply program, for example, Soviet works, and then program pieces like this Emil Levin piece with equal validity to, say, Shostakovich, which we hear routinely on the concert stage. I don't think that there's a lot of people like in or outside of classical music saying that Shostakovich is only valid because of his oppression under the Soviet state, right? He's a valid composer. So kind of, I think those are really important questions when we're conceptualizing programs and how we would teach this in classical music, but also in the pieces that are selected for things like museums, even for background music and things like films or exhibits. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that response. Thank you. Okay, so we've got time for one final question. So luckily we've managed to get through all of them. So this one is for Leah from Lani. In comparing clothing that was made in a camp to contemporary clothing, do you also compare the countries of origin of who made or designed the garment? It was surprising and interesting to see a similar style between the sweater made in Riga to sweaters worn in England.
Yes, so I think you definitely should be comparing country of origin to the garment, although this becomes kind of less important by the 1930s, 1940s. There's a lot more kind of fashion discourse across borders by this time, especially in urban areas. So someplace like Warsaw, Berlin, Riga, Vilna, in photographs, if you look at people's clothing, they're looking much more similar to New York, London, Chicago, kind of anywhere else in the Western world. So they kind of become, there's a little less difference over time, but particularly with anything that involves kind of folk art, it's really important to look at country of origin.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and for everyone who participated in asking some wonderful questions, I think, and hopefully you'll agree it instilled some lively discussion. So thank you very much. So I'm going to take this opportunity now to call this panel to a close so we can have a break before our first keynote, which will begin at 6 p.m. UK time. So where we will be joined by Professor Roma Sendika from Jagiellonian University, and her paper will be entitled Polish Folk Art and the Holocaust, Perpetrator, Victim, Bystander, Memory, Transactions. So we'll hopefully see you all very shortly. Thank you very much. Thank you.